And I would like to welcome everyone to the AASSC's virtual book launch for The Fur Trader from Oslo to Oxford House. For anyone who might not know me, my name is Amy Poole. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the webmaster for the Association for the Advancement of Scandinavian Studies in Canada. I am wearing a black shirt with white polka dots on it, and in my background, you will see a beige wall as well as a black and blue chair that I'm sitting in. And I would like to note that the AASSC recognizes, respects, and celebrates diversity in our international network of researchers and professionals. As an academic interdisciplinary organization, we work to foster an inclusive environment dedicated to removing harmful barriers against race, sexuality, gender identity, mental or physical ability, racialized minorities, and Indigenous communities. We honor the Indigenous communities, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, as sovereign peoples across Turtle Island and elevate the importance of elders guiding and informing our organization. With our research in all aspects of Scandinavia and the Nordic region, the AASSC supports the rich diversity and knowledge of the Sámi peoples and the Kalalit, Tunumit, and Unuhuit. The AASSC works to ensure a welcoming and accessible environment to all. And we are pleased to provide a platform today for our speakers, Gerd Kjostad Mortensen, Dr. Daniel Sims, and Dr. Ingrid Erberg, who each collaborated to publish this book today. We are also welcoming guests from North America and Norway, alongside our participants joining us across the globe, and we are very glad to have you here. So before we begin, just as a note, this is the third session that we've had in our virtual series with previous presentation by Dr. Henry Milner earlier in the year in 2022. We're very excited to continue this virtual series and hear from our speakers today as we celebrate this book launch. And before we begin, there are just a few things that we ask that you keep in mind as the virtual series session continues. Firstly, your microphones have been muted upon entering the Zoom room. There will be an opportunity to unmute your microphone following the presentation when we enter a Q&A period. The session, as I noted, will be recorded, and the recording will be sent to all registrants soon after the session today, should you wish to review it. A survey will also be emailed out to everyone following today's session. We ask that you please fill it out so that it can inform future AASSC programming, and it should really only take about 5 minutes of your time. Today's presentation will be approximately 35 to 50 minutes in length, with 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. During the Q&A period, you can either type in your question in the chat box below, or you can click the raise hand button, which is just in the chat portion of the webinar here, to request to ask your question over the microphone as well, at which point we can unmute you and go from there. The Fur Trader from Oslo to Oxford House is a critical edition of Einar Odd Mortensen Sr.'s personal narrative detailing the years, 1925 to 1928, that he spent as a free trader at posts in Pine Bluff and Oxford Lake in Manitoba during the waning days of the fur trade. Mortensen's original narrative has been translated from Norwegian to English and supplemented with a scholarly introduction, thorough annotations, a bibliography, and a reading guide. This additional material presents the author as a product of Norwegian culture at the time and guides the reader through a close reading of Mortensen's interpretation of his work and his travels, the people he encountered, the Indian residential school system, and Indigenous participation in the First World War. If you're interested in purchasing the book as well, I will be posting the link momentarily in the chat so that you can take a look at it just a bit later. We are, of course, honored to have our speakers here today to offer their insight and knowledge around the process of the book. Gerd Kjostad Mortensen is the daughter-in-law of Einar Odd Mortensen Sr. She holds a Master's of Education and has taught at Oslo College, Hamar College, and the University of Stavanger. Introducing the editors of the book, Dr. Daniel Sims is a member of the Tse-Kedene First Nation. He is Associate Professor of First Nation Studies at the University of Northern British Columbia. And our third speaker is Dr. Ingrid Erberg, who edited the book with Dr. Sims. She is a longtime member of the AASSC and is Associate Professor of Scandinavian Studies at the Augustana campus at the University of Alberta. With that, I would like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Erberg to begin.
Thanks, Amy, for the introduction and for setting up this book launch. Gerd, Daniel, and I welcome this opportunity to share a bit about our collaboration, a collaboration which has resulted in this translated critical edition of Einar Odd Mortensen's The Fur Trader, published by the University of Alberta Press. So I'm going to provide a brief introduction about how we ended up working together, and then I will share what I have brought to the project with my Norwegian language skills and expertise in personal narratives and Norwegian immigrant literature. And finally, I'll highlight what makes this edition unique, and Amy has already touched on a little bit of that. Finally, after I speak, Daniel will discuss what he has brought to the project as a historian and a scholar of Indigenous studies. And Gerd will then outline her role in the compilation of the original Norwegian language edition, and she'll share some personal experiences and perspectives of Einar Odd Mortensen, her father-in-law. Before I talk about our collaborative work, however, I would like to introduce you to the text by reading the first page of the introduction, which Daniel and I co-authored, and by showing you a few images that appear in the book. And the photo on the left is of Einar Odd Mortensen in northern Manitoba, taken sometime between 1925 and 28. So reading from the introduction. In 1925, 23-year-old Norwegian Einar Odd Mortensen left his job as a farmhand near Oslo to pursue work and seek adventure in the fur trading business in Manitoba. Though we do not know how long he intended to stay or whether he was considering making this move a permanent one, we do know that he moved back home in 1928. A few years later, he married the girlfriend he had left behind and spent the rest of his life working in the family's furniture store in Oslo, an urban existence far removed from his 3-year stint in what he called the Canadian wilderness at trading posts in Pine Bluff and Oxford House. Though he wrote a draft manuscript describing his Canadian experiences shortly after returning to Norway, he never completed it. Eventually, his incomplete work was pieced together and edited by his daughter-in-law and son, Gerd Sjustad Mortensen and Einar Odd Mortensen Jr. It was first published in Norwegian in 2007, nearly 40 years after Mortensen's death in 1969. With this English translation, Mortensen's story is now available to a much broader audience. Like many collaborative projects, this has taken a long time. I first met Gerd at the 2011 AASSC conference in New Brunswick, and she presented a paper there on the Norwegian edition of The Fur Trader. And I expressed interest in using a possible English translation of the work in my literature course, Personal Narratives of the North, which I teach here at Augustana. And we kept in touch over the following years, and Gerd had the text translated into English by several parties, including a professional translation company. In conjunction with her trip to New Brunswick, Gerd traveled to the Paw in Manitoba with a Finnish-Canadian acquaintance, and she was able to visit some of the places described in the book. She also participated in a roundtable meeting with local historians who shared additional information, and she interacted with descendants of some of the people with whom Mortensen likely interacted. In addition, she met Dr. Rosalind Ing, an Opaswayak Cree elder, known for her work in the areas of social justice, healthcare, and education. And Dr. Ing visited Gerd the following summer in Norway. She advised Gerd that it was critical for her to collaborate with academics that could provide a historical and cultural context for contemporary readers before the work could be published in North America. And at this stage, Gerd asked me to review the English translation of The Fur Trader, and I was of the opinion that the translation needed to be revisited and revised if it were to be published. I indicated my willingness to both edit the translation and also work on an introduction for a North American audience. In addition, I saw the need to include notes to provide historical and cultural context as suggested by Dr. Ing. So in 2017, I approached Daniel Sims, who was at Augustana at the time, and he was interested in co-authoring a scholarly introduction and notes for the narrative. Our team was then complete, and it has been a pleasure to work with Gerd and Daniel. And though Rosalind Ing passed away in July of 2020, before this English edition was completed, her advice to Gerd in its early stages was intrinsic to its completion. So returning to the images that you see, the top right image is one that Mortensen took of a dog team in Norway House, Manitoba, during his second winter with his own dog team. Mortensen traveled by dog sled from the Paw to his first trading post at Pine Bluff, which was the first of many journeys by dog sled. And the image in the lower right was taken at God's Lake, east of Norway House. Mortensen describes various types of interactions with trading post customers in several locations. And these images provide snapshots of Mortensen's activities, and they also illustrate that there are unnamed contributors to this project. These include people, many of them Indigenous and Métis, who interacted with and assisted Mortensen in a variety of ways, making his stay and work in Manitoba possible. The three of us, Daniel, Gerd, and I, are of course looking forward to seeing how this contextualized narrative is received in Canada. And Amy, if you could go to the next slide. One of the things I explore in the introduction that I would like to share with you is how the 2007 Norwegian edition received a fair bit of attention when it was published in Norway by Gyldendal, one of the largest Norwegian publishing houses. And it received this attention both due to the way in which it was compiled, pieced together by the family, and due to the setting in northern Canada. This geographical region has long fascinated many Norwegians, particularly after the publication in 1931 of the account of another Norwegian temporary migrant, Helge Ingstad, who spent 4 years between 1926 and 1930 hunting and trapping in the Great Slave Lake region of the Northwest Territories. This account, translated into English as The Land of Feast and Famine, was one of the best-selling Norwegian books of the 20th century. And I don't have time to say more about this personal narrative, but I was well familiar with both this text and its location when I met Gerd in 2011. I had published an article on Helge Ingstad in his time in the Northwest Territories, and I had also spent time at a homestead on the east arm of Great Slave Lake. And I've given you a picture of that here. Given these connections, I was fascinated to read how the critical reception of Mortensen's work in Norway frequently referenced Ingstad. And in fact, the majority of the reviews framed Mortensen's experiences and narrative in light of Ingstad's adventures and the literary quality of Ingstad's book. And as I said, that's something that I explore in the introduction. Okay, I guess we're ready for the next slide, Amy. So what is new about this edition? Amy already read a bit of that from the back of from the book jacket. Clearly, the scholarly introduction and notes, which cover topics ranging from Mortensen's use of the term wilderness, autobiographical theory, and linguistic code switching, to the Canadian fur trade as an economic colonial project, fur trade memoirs, and residential schools. Gerd has written an epilogue in which she discusses her personal perspectives on the book and its author. And Daniel and I have also contributed a reading guide and discussion questions suitable for students, book clubs, or interested individuals. And I'd like to read a couple of these questions. And by doing so, I'm going to give you a sense of certain elements of the narrative. I think that's an effective way to introduce you to the text. So one of these questions comes from the themes section. And the question is, silencing is a theme that is central to Indigenous studies and gender studies. Discuss the ways in which various voices and perspectives, particularly those of Indigenous men and women and settler women, are marginalized, even silenced in the text. Another question from the literary studies section of the reading guide. The fur trade starts in medias res, in the middle of things, and ends abruptly in the same way. Do you find this strategy to be satisfying or unsatisfying? Why? A question from the history portion of the guide. Place Mortensen's adventures within the context of colonization in Canada. What type of colonialism, if any, do you think he represents, and why? What are the implications of Mortensen being aware or unaware of his role? And then we have a section called Additional Questions, and I'll read a couple from that section. Identify and discuss one or two passages that trouble you as a contemporary reader. And the second, if you could ask Einar Odd Mortensen a question about his time in the Canadian North, what would it be? And I'd be happy to answer that. I'm sure Gerd would as well when we get to the question and answer period. And I'm sure Daniel also has questions that he would like to ask Einar Odd Mortensen. And finally, the last slide, Amy. Thanks. So the final feature of this edition that I want to mention are two illustrations by Norwegian artist Birger Kraner, which we have used as bookends to the memoir portion of the English edition. Kraner lived for a period of time in Vancouver, and he met Einar Odd Mortensen in Oslo, where the two men shared stories of their time in Canada. And he didn't talk a lot about his time in Canada with his family, but he did share some, clearly some portions of his time there with Kraner. As I've written in the introduction, Kraner was inspired to draw pictures of Mortensen's adventures in Manitoba. Mortensen employed the bartering ways he had used in Manitoba, and he gave Kraner some furniture in exchange for the illustrations. And these currently hang in Gerd's living room in Strømmen, Norway. And we thought they would make such an effective frame given their themes. Early in his account, Mortensen sets off for Pine Bluff, camping in the cold, and you see that type of camping on the left. And the last chapter of the narrative is called Days at Oxford Lake, and it ends with Mortensen returning from a trading trip. His dog sled is loaded with valuable furs, and he and his Indigenous traveling companion are struggling to keep on course in a blinding blizzard. The men and the dogs are freezing and exhausted, and that illustration, the illustration to the right there, depicts this type of situation. Now, since I've spent long hours working with the language in the text and the translation, I want to end my segment by reading the beginning of the narrative. And this is from chapter 1, which is called North of the 53rd Parallel. I'll read the first couple paragraphs, and I'd like to point out that Mortensen used the term Indianer, the English translation being Indians, to describe Indigenous individuals with whom he interacted, and we have kept this term in English. As we point out in a note, this term was historically used in Canada to refer to First Nations individuals, but it is, of course, offensive, considered offensive today. So this is the beginning of the narrative. Everything is still unclear to me. All I know is that I'm heading for a trading post in the Canadian wilderness. There I am going to buy pelts from the Indians and do some trapping myself. I will also act as general manager of the trading post. I am here in a place called the Pas, a border town on the edge of the wilderness. Or to be more precise, it is the town in the wilderness. I am waiting for a certain Icelander who is traveling north with a dog team. I hope to be able to accompany him to the trading post, which is located approximately 200 miles from here. The trip will take 5 or 6 days by dog sled. He should have been here several days ago, so I am starting to feel both impatient and tense. I am longing for the wilderness and the life there. What will the experience bring? How will a greenhorn like me manage out there? The die has been cast and the unknown is calling to me. It is time to get started. If only that Icelander would get here soon. So thank you, and I will pass it over to Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid. Thank you. As Ingrid mentioned, the way I got involved was she was told that in order for us to publish it, it needed to have that proper scholarly context. And I was very pleased when Ingrid approached me while I was working at Augustana as a faculty member to get on board with this memoir. I think it's a very important document. One of the things that fascinated me from the beginning was it's a fur trade record from the 20th century. And as somebody who's worked on fur trade history for years at this point in time and still does, I was recently going through some Hudson's Bay Company journals for Fort St. James here with regard to some work that I'm doing. Getting records from the 20th century can be incredibly difficult, to say the least. And getting records that aren't from the Hudson's Bay Company can be equally difficult. So Einar did not work for the Hudson's Bay Company. I don't want to suggest by this slide that he did. He has some rather choice views regarding the Hudson's Bay Company, which I don't think he was alone in having. But the one thing about the Hudson's Bay Company is it has dominated the fur trade history, the fur trade record, largely because it still exists as a company in Canada. So it never went out of business. It has those records that persist. And so this opportunity to work on what we call a free trade memoir was certainly something that I was really excited to do. Was really eye-opening. I think it really contributes to that larger conversation of what the fur trade was in Canada and challenges that notion that it is, again, just Hudson's Bay Company that had control of it. So I really liked that opportunity. Again, having in the 20th century was key, but also having for somebody who wasn't necessarily invested in the history of Canada. So there's also that issue as well. A lot of the fur trade history that we have in Canada is by people who are very interested in making sure that Canada comes across in a very positive light. And that can, of course, skew the record. I'm not saying that Einar necessarily wanted to cast Canada in a negative light, I'm certainly not saying that. But I do believe that he provided an honest account of what his experiences were in the fur trade, his experiences were with regards to working with Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in the fur trade, and just his overall experiences in general. So he wasn't necessarily in any way, shape, or form trying to justify anything in that sense. I was also excited with the opportunity of this project of working with a contemporary record again from the 20th century that looks at kind of the Indigenous experience in Canada, albeit through the lens of Einar's perspective. But it was really interesting as I actually delved into the text and provided context for what was occurring, just how much was being revealed by actually looking at this record, how much was actually being shown. And one of the issues that I don't know if we ever resolved it, and maybe it will be resolved one day, was the role of the Métis in the text at all. So this is a larger question. This is a larger issue in Canada to this day, particularly who are the Métis, who are not the Métis, how are they related to First Nations peoples, what connection do they have with non-Indigenous populations? And that was one of the questions that kind of emerged as I read through the actual memoir itself. And again, it's not necessarily something that is settled. So it's still an ongoing debate kind of in the literature. So when we look at this, it is a memoir of a fur trader, but it is dealing with this rather important time period, providing a perspective that's outside of the norm, outside of the Hudson's Bay Company mold, but also is touching on some subjects that are still being debated to this day. So getting into that larger context there. And then even things like going through and getting translations for some of the Swampy Cree phrases that are in the text itself. So there was a process of getting that involved with that. That was an interesting process because it involved contacting different people from different institutions and asking them if they be willing to, volunteer their time, or if we could provide them an honorarium, but just kind of getting that feedback. And I think, this is an important project because it does highlight this time period. And in many ways, kind of shows what happens, when you have somebody like Gerd who actually works with individuals from the PAW and works with them to actually produce this memoir in a way that is meaningful and respectful to the overall community. So I was really excited to be involved in it. And then I'll always remember this project as the project that I worked on during the pandemic. So we've been working on it prior to that, certainly, but this was the big to-do in 2020. And so spent a lot of time actually just kind of going over things, reworking things, and gave me something to do while I was in quarantine, as all of us were, I imagine. But this is kind of the project. So I was really happy to see it come forward, have it come through, and really excited about what it represents. And for those of you who aren't aware, I had COVID last week, so I'm going to cut my talk short right here rather than start coughing. So thank you.
At this point, I would like to invite Gerd, if you would like to speak. I believe you were muted right now, Gerd. Sorry.
So now I think there is some voice coming out, right? Okay.
Good for me.
Yeah, okay, fine. Well, I'd like to make some comments also about the material and the manuscript, and also a bit about the family background of my father-in-law. My husband, Einar Odd Mortensen, you can see the picture of him here. He had heard about his father having been in Canada and fur trading, but he hadn't seen any materials or anything from it. So when his father died, he went up in the attic, I remember, and he told me about it to see and look for some material, but he didn't find, and he was very disappointed. He thought he would have found some evidence of his time spent in Canada. But many years later, after his father's death, Lisa, my husband's sister, she had taken care of materials from her father, pictures that he had taken, as you can see there, and also an attempt to make a manuscript. And all this we tried, and he had also notes, and he had tried to make a manuscript himself, but he just didn't have time to finish it. I think so. It was just it was just kept for some time, and Lisa took care of it. And of course, I was very happy for that. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a Norwegian manuscript at all. But the bits and pieces I tried to put together, because my husband then he had developed cancer, and he said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this. This is too much for me now." So the two of us together worked on it, and I put words on it from all I found there and what was delivered to us, and put it into a manuscript and delivered it to Gyldendal, as Ingrid mentioned. And I delivered 2 chapters, and they answered me quite quickly that they wanted the rest of the book. So I worked on that, and in 2007, an English and a Norwegian manuscript was published by Gyldendal, and I was very happy for that book, because many papers were interested, and the Norwegian Broadcasting Company were interested, and we got a lot of attention afterwards after publishing. So that was much fun, and that this book could be so interesting to Norwegian readers. So we were both amazed, really, looking at the material, how he really had to survive, or how he survived in a very challenging environment in Manitoba. He came there in 1925, and that was in November. like this month and 97 years ago. And I was there later in 2011, as Ingrid said, and I could imagine how tough it might have been by the river there, Saskatchewan River, and also the many lakes and with all the mosquitoes that he told about in the book. But why did he go to Manitoba? That was because he really wanted to be a farmer. He had he grew up in Oslo, but and took his exams and so on there from high school, and even started to study medicine, but gave up after 1 year and went out in the countryside and worked as a farmhand there. And he liked it so well, so he wanted to buy a farm. He had a girlfriend who he asked to be with him on this farm project, but she turned him down. And she said, "I will not be a farmer's wife. That's not what I have in mind." So, being disappointed, I think it was, and he immigrated to Canada. We had a little trouble, my husband and I, to understand why he took this dramatic choice. But for us, it was interesting to get to know my father-in-law and Einar's father much better through what we found. And we were very much impressed by what we experienced, what we saw he had experienced, especially from the pictures he had taken, but also from what he had written down. This Norwegian manuscript was also published in Finnish in 2009. And finally now, the third trainer manuscript in English in 2022, which you saw a picture of course, from Ingrid. And this process started already in 2011, really a long delivery process. Ingrid and Daniel, as editors, have together focused on the text and the story of my father-in-law's life in Canada, while being there as a fur trader from 1925 to 1928. I'd like to portray my husband a little bit further and my father-in-law a little bit further, as both a furniture trader and a family man, and the way I learned to know him in Norway. His career as a furniture trader started when his father asked him to come back to Norway, because there was originally a one-man's business venture, but with so many siblings and so many relatives, it turned out to be a shareholding store. And in the course of this change, my father-in-law was asked to come to Norway and help out his father in this new business administration. My father-in-law was then, by that time, already an experienced fur trader, so he could maybe be the best one to play an important role in the change of the furniture business as well. Though I'm not sure if this is what my father-in-law really wanted to do. I think, both my husband and I thought that he would have liked to stay longer in Canada, but loyal to his father, he came to Norway. he returned, and maybe that is also an explanation why why there is such an abrupt ending of the book, because I think there might have been more telling about his life there if he had stayed longer. So now he was a shopkeeper and administrator in the furniture store, and with all the shareholders of his family, and all of them wanted to have good furniture in their store. I think the other one, Amy, in between. Could you take the other PowerPoint, please? That one, yes. Because this furniture store developed to be very successful in many ways. They had their own designs and imported different styles of furniture from all over Europe. And here is really the Duke of Edinburgh promoting British furniture, old colonial furniture, in Mortensen's furniture store, and with, of course, my father-in-law there to the left and the Duke to the right. It was rather a big event, I think, for the Mortensen furniture store to have the only right to sell that sort of furniture, which I, in fact, still have in my kitchen. Yeah, and I think why he wanted to stay longer maybe before he returned to Norway was that he had started to know more about the fur trading after 3 years. So maybe he was a little bit reluctant, but of course, I don't quite know. I have just talked to my husband about it and relatives and friends of his about his stay. I told you about him also wanted to make a manuscript, but he also might have a reason for giving up that project, because Helge Ingstad, as Ingrid mentioned, also published a book about his adventures in Alberta, and I think especially around Slave Lake, as you showed a picture of, Ingrid. I'm glad my sister-in-law had taken care of the material left behind after my father-in-law's death. And she also tried to make a manuscript of hers, of her own, but she would rather have Einar, my husband, to do it because he was retired and she thought he might do a good job at it. But it ended up with me. I think he did a good job as managing the furniture store. He traveled a lot to find his special furnitures, and the furniture store had customers from all over Norway and even royal customers. I would like to add also that he became a single parent to Lise, my sister-in-law, because he was a widower, and Lise was left behind with just her father to take care of her, which was a little problematic, I think. And Lisa said so herself. She missed her mother very much, and it was really, I think, sort of a competition between how my father-in-law should share his time between the store and taking care of his daughter. And I think maybe in that battle, the store won in many ways. But as a single parent and provider, Lisa had all her materialistic needs provided for, but something was missing, of course, without a mother. And I'd like to say that my husband and I were often invited to my father-in-law, and he was his home was, of course, nicely and furnished, beautiful furnished, and always Einar Odd dressed for the occasion. I noticed that very clearly, because when we came to visit, he wore his special jacket. We call it røykejakke. It is a sort of special jacket, and for him it was a sign of relaxation. Then he was in his own home and could relax from the store. Normally he wore a white frock in the store, and wearing a black suit, as you can see on this picture, when he had royal visitors and important visitors maybe. But otherwise, lots of visitors from all over Norway, as mentioned. But I think, can you have the next PowerPoint, Amy? But here he is, I think, in his favorite surroundings. He liked picking flowers, picking berries. He hunted, he was fishing, and he was a nature-loving person. And he took us on walks with him several times. And a speciality of his was picking caraway sprouts early in spring and going back home to make soup of it, almost special broth, very delicious. But simple food, as he had been used to in Manitoba, with fish, with whitefish and bannock, which I was also served at an adoption party where I met Rosalind Ing, as mentioned by Ingrid. It was served there also, bannock and whitefish. I thought that was extremely interesting. And my father-in-law speaks much about it also in the book, Bannock and Whitefish. He served also simple food when we visited him up in his cabin in the mountains. One time he served us just cured ham and flatbread, nice crispy bread, and I think something typical in Norwegian. He lived, summing up, a stressful and rather turbulent life in the family store, but fortunately able to relax in his home with his special jacket on. His last meal I'd like to mention, the day of New Year, the New Year's Day of 1969, just having had his 66th birthday. Then he enjoyed a late breakfast with rakfisk, which is really special, I think. We call it delicacy, but not many like it. Maybe foreigners don't like it much. We have had foreign visitors on it, but it is a salted fermented trout dish with a rather peculiar smell. But this is how it could be, or fish could be served, by salting it and also fermenting it, of course. Very simple and a very typical Christmas dish in Norway. His experience from Canada with simple food like bannock and whitefish was with him to the very end, but in a Norwegian manner for his last meal. Sadly for us, he did not want to share his story in Canada. I admired my father-in-law because I think he was true to his values all his life. He managed both fur trading and furniture trading in a successful way. And I would also add that he was a very generous person to those that needed help and support from him. And one of his favorite organizations was the Salvation Army, who he contributed with quite a lot, I understood. Finally, I would like to add that this English manuscript and version of the Fur Trainer has gone through a long process, but I'm happy to say today that changes, compromises, and additions made to the original manuscript have made the Fur Trader story even more interesting and valuable. So to you, Daniel and Ingrid, my sincere thanks for that contribution from the two of you, very knowledgeable editors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for everyone for each of your segments. They were also fascinating to hear just these different aspects and stories of the process. And of course, a final thank you to our speakers for your insight today. It was really wonderful to listen to you. And if you're interested in like if our audience is interested in learning more about upcoming virtual series sessions, we do update our webpage frequently when they are announced, and I'll always announce on social media through Instagram, Twitter. That is my realm. So any interest there, we'll be posting there. So thank you so much again. If you do need to contact anyone here, we have our president, Natalie Van Duysen, as well as Matthew Etherington, his email, and then my email, which is the AASSC Communications email. So thank you again, and I hope that you all have a lovely rest of your day.